Tonight we are going to Iceland, and we are not doing the warm geothermal spa influencer version. No, we are doing the ocean edge basalt teeth version, where the wind has knives and the water is a physics lecture about hypothermia. You are being placed here at the wrong century, and the wrong season, and you are doing it on purpose. The present tense is important. This is happening to your body right now. The volcanic surf detonates in sheets of white noise. Fulmars scream at you because they own this coast. The world is grey metal and sulfur. Your eyelashes sting. This is not cozy. This is the kind of beginning where your phone battery would be dead within 14 seconds if phones existed. Also, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You drag your boots through volcanic sand like ground meteor charcoal. The 19th century Icelandic coast is not pretty in a wallpaper way. It is morally heavy. The Atlantic is a statement about scale. You are here in late autumn 1830s-ish. The exact microdate historians still argue whether to assign to your arrival. The ship left you, not maliciously, just indifferently. Shipping schedules in the 1830s basically operate like weather dice. You are wet, you are shivering, you are looking at basalt stacks like negative cathedrals built by geology that is tired of you. The air smells like seaweed, rotten kelp, half-dried fish skins, and some faint sweet mineral note that feels like warm coins. You do not know this yet, but that warm coin smell is lichen. Lichen is going to eat your entire life direction. Mainstream historical fact drop number 1. 19th century Iceland had one of the lowest tree densities on Earth. The island had been deforested heavily after settlement nearly 800 years earlier, and so fuel and heat and building material were existential, daily contested arenas. This is why everything is smoke and peat and driftwood triage. You walk through this like it's normal. But your modern brain is still like, wow, this place is structured like a survival side quest. That is why the sensory volume is so intense. There is no tree buffer. Nothing attenuates the wind. You get the raw air feed. Your toes are already numb. That is fine. You are becoming a person who will study organisms who move slower than human economy. You will later joke, quietly, to yourself, that you are becoming a monk of extremely boring miracles. You begin walking toward the farmstead that said they would take you for the winter. They don't think you are doing science. They think you are a type of curious foreign hybrid. They think you are an educated oddity. Iceland is used to absorbing oddities. This island is basically a liminal airport terminal before airports exist. The lava fields are a delirium maze. They look like frozen ocean foam, except pitch black. And everywhere, lichens. Orange discs, pale mint crusts, sulfur yellow scrapes, charcoal cracks with neon microthreads like something halfway between embroidery and frostbite. The first joke lands inside your head. You laugh because you realize lichen are basically microscopic goth confetti. This is joke 1. It helps that you are sleep deprived. You need to keep warm humor as a coping mechanism. Without humor you get brittle. You step on one basalt plate and it shifts because the ice under it is hollow. Your soul leaves your spine for a second. But you keep your face neutral because this is Iceland and you must impress everyone with stoicism immediately. You are trying to rehearse your new personality. Calm, slow, perceptive. Accepting that everything here is trying to kill you but politely. Second joke, light. Small. You keep thinking this island is basically Dark Souls biome design years before Dark Souls exists. That is how your brain organizes threat. It works. There is folklore here that some people used powdered old lichen as a dye for wool that made the yarn shift color under moonlight. Not obviously, not like a glow stick, but like a subtle spectral drift. Was this pigment actually chemically doing that? Historians still argue whether this is a hallucination plus confirmation bias, or whether certain lichen compounds genuinely shift hue under specific humidity plus lunar angle combinations. You decide you are going to keep that story in your back pocket forever because it is too good. You see the small turf farm emerging from the mist like a half-buried whale spine. You smell seal fat lamp smoke. You will live here. You will live inside a building that is basically an earth battery. You will sleep on turf beds. You will read by tallow. And you will spend all your surplus cognition reading the slow languages of lichens. Third joke. You begin mentally drafting your future thesis abstract, and you realize that your thesis abstract is literally just tiny slow organisms that do not care about me at all. You smirk. Scholars in 2025 will relate to this deeply. You knock. The family takes you in. You hang your soaped wool. You introduce yourself. They mostly call you the girl who writes everything down. That is your identity crypt. That is your class. That is your skill tree. This is not an insult. This is a power-up. The bed is straw and turf and wool. You lie down. You can hear the Atlantic like blood pressure. You think about the fact that Denmark technically administrates this entire island right now, colonial but bureaucratic rather than militarized. That is why you came, the archive pipeline. Copenhagen is the core. But Iceland is the proving ground. You stare at the turf ceiling. There is lichen there too. Of course there is. This island basically says, if you can't read slow growth, go home. You make a vow. Out loud. Soft. You say, I will learn this slowness. I will map this slowness. I will not let men in London erase me later. They will try anyway. Your vow is the narrative lock. The coast was the die roll. Now the arc begins. You sleep. Or you approximate sleep. In a volcanic basement of the world. Where the wind is a percussion instrument and the moss is older than your language. Tomorrow you will begin apprenticing to lichen. You wake up in a turf house that feels like it was excavated from a Tolkien root system, except there is no fantasy reward chest, just cold air stratification science. The first full day, you go outside and the basalt is beaded with thaw dew, and the lichen that coats this coast is already whispering absurdly slow information channels. You start apprenticing yourself to moss plus lichen like this is an actual formal apprenticeship, except no guild, no exam, no master, except the land itself. Which is deeply annoying, because even though you are becoming the woman who will study lichen in 19th century Iceland, those lichens will never accelerate just for your convenience. They will never respond to your urgency. They are here to teach you that the scale of meaning is not human metabolism. You are here to learn scale decentering. And because this is bedtime, that slow decentering is already gently lowering your heart rate. First historical mainstream fact drop in this section. 19th century Icelandic natural history collecting culture was small, but Icelandically weirdly rigorous. Pastors, midwives, sheep farmers, and amateur counter of phenomena, types often kept extremely detailed meteorological and organism observation logs, because there is literally nothing else to do when an island makes you be slow. So this is fertile. You are not alone. You are not the only obsessive. Just, you are the first one who will fanatically choose lichen. The first week, you mostly just kneel. That's the apprenticeship posture. You kneel next to basalt. You kneel next to turf. You kneel next to dead drift whales. You kneel until your knees become an instrument. You mark little areas with tiny natural landmarks. Basalt flake here, sheep bone shard there, a small glint of volcanic glass. This is your analog coordinate grid. Because GPS does not exist. Your brain becomes GPS. And already you realize, lichen are not moss. Moss is a plant. Lichen is a symbiosis between fungus plus algae, sometimes cyanobacteria. That symbiosis is your curriculum. Every single day from now on. There is a folk claim here that certain lichen clumps can predict the severity of winter based on how fast they rehydrate after a certain kind of frost snap. Historians still argue whether this is pattern recognition that works, or whether this is confirmation bias with charismatic microcrust organisms. You decide to test it later. But it already feels deliciously pseudo-measurable enough to log in your field book. You walk with the pastor's daughter sometimes. She is your translator, your practical social glue, your Icelandic interpreter, but also your first girl lab partner. She's a midwife in training. She knows herbs, microfungi, where moss can soothe burns, where certain types of peat reduce infection risk. She does not think in disciplinary boundaries. You like her instantly. You two spend half your field hours pretending the basalt is a library and each lichen formation is a different shelf. You can barely even pronounce half the Latin you used to memorize at university. But here, naming is slower. Naming must be ledgered into anchor reality, because translation mistakes have survival cost. Your second joke this section. You tell her that modern scientists will one day invent expensive skincare products that literally just extract molecules from these tiny lichens you are kneeling over. She laughs so hard she snorts, because she thinks you are making a fantasy joke. In 2025, the cosmetic biotech side of lichen is extremely real. Walking basalt coast ridges becomes your daily cardio. Your neck stiffens from constantly scanning microtextures. You begin making little classification heuristics based on color, substrate, thickness, hydration pattern, where the birds perch, where seal fat smoke drifts. You are building an embodied neural catalog. Your handwriting begins to slant in new ways. You write slower, because you now think slower. And slower is becoming your competitive advantage. Historians still argue whether your university training or your severe sensory immersion in Iceland is actually the real reason you succeed. You suspect the answer is obvious. The land is your real professor. And the land is relentless. There is zero room for ego when the wind has the force of a minor transportation accident. Inside the turf house, at night, you start sketching lichen cross-sections. You sketch the fungal hyphae. You sketch the photobiont pockets. You sketch every weird intermediate morphological stage you can catch. Because you suspect, rightfully, that there are intermediate morphotypes that don't fit clean taxonomy. And this is the beginning of your future war with London classifier men. Third joke this section. You realize that if lichens had a Tinder, every lichen profile would say it's complicated. You write it in your notebook margin just to amuse yourself. Eventually, you start sampling tiny fragments, never ripping whole patches. You become extremely ethical about smallness. Minimal disturbance. The pastor's daughter likes this, because she sees you treating land like sentience instead of resource. She decides you are worth protecting socially. She quietly runs interference when older men try to interrogate what you are doing. She tells them you are doing a type of Danish observational commission, kind of true. She tells them that someday your notebook might be valuable, very true. She also tells them that this kind of microorganism work is slow and extremely boring, so they should leave you alone, strategically true. You begin building your own careful Icelandic field taxonomy, not replacing Linnaean names, but layering Icelandic metaphor over them. This is how your mind holds the data. You begin to suspect this syncretic dual language technique is the secret to how your work will survive erasure later. Because the metaphors are culturally local. They give your samples coordinates that cannot be stolen easily. History fact number 2 for this section. Its mainstream Darwin in the 1830s was literally still mid-Beagle voyage and would not publish for decades. You are doing your lichen work at the same historical moment that the biological world is about to fracture open with evolution theory. You do not know this timeline yet. But your field ethic of symbiosis is weirdly adjacent to the future conceptual rupture. This is the quiet part where your apprenticeship becomes irreversible. You realize you now visually parse landscape differently. Basalt is not rock anymore. It is habitat matrix. Every ridge is a transcript. Every orange crust is a chemical essay. Every mint green disk cluster is a time capsule with the handwriting of cold centuries. You are not collecting plants. You are collecting time. And you feel something inside your chest unhook from urgency. Iceland is forcing you into time discipline. Slow is now a martial art for you. Your days end with peat smoke in your hair. Your nights end with your fingers smelling like frost and lichen acids. You sleep deeper than you ever have in your life. The wind stops sounding violent and becomes white noise that is basically ASMR avant la lettre. This is the apprenticeship phase. You are reframing your entire cognition around organisms that move slower than empire. Slower than capital. Slower than human ego. That is why this woman would become legendary later. Because you committed to tempo humility before anyone imagined it was a scientific methodology. The coast keeps shifting. Salt frost keeps carving. You keep kneeling. Lichen keeps teaching. This is the beginning of your real career. You start realizing very early that Iceland does not let you be just one category of human. And because you're a woman in the 1830s, you are constantly category disobedient just by existing with a notebook and a method. The pastor's daughter begins calling you the midwife of tiny organisms half-jokingly. But it sticks, and it weirdly becomes the cultural wrapper that allows you to keep expanding your access. Midwives in Iceland are allowed everywhere. Midwives go to all farms, all seasons, all micro corners of turf houses. Midwives are allowed to be both gossip receivers and extremely private vaults. And your brain, your ASMR slow sarcastic brain, goes, oh, I have the perfect socially accepted carrier identity now. That identity will quietly protect my lichen research like a cloak. You apprentice yourself to lichen. She apprentices herself to human birth. The parallel structure is deliciously poetic. You both become anomalous knowledge vectors in a landscape that is basically a physics sim designed to punish certainty. Mainstream historical fact drop right here so we anchor this properly. Icelandic midwives in the 19th century often trained directly under pastors and were required to learn extremely precise herbal pharmacology because formal physicians were extremely rare outside Reykjavik. So the pastoral plus medical plus botanical braid is not fringe. It is literally normal. You are simply doing the micro-extreme variant of normal. You start doing this thing when you go out on surveys where you say little half-whisper commentary to the lichen like it's a baby that takes 60 years to learn one verb. The pastor's daughter thinks this is hysterical. Third small side comment joke here. She teases you that you have the opposite of ADHD. You have attention survives decades. You tell her if future scientists invent diagnostic acronyms they should name that exact thing after you. She rolls her eyes. Iceland eye rolls have additional wind exposure energy. You are also beginning to think in fungal teleology. This should concern you. You do not see clean logical cause anymore because this place is too slow for cause. You see emergent entrainment. You see the way certain orange crust lichen clings to basalt surfaces where salt spray frequency is exactly right, and that micro-calibrated persistence feels like a sermon about patient strategy. You are not religious in the strict sense. But you begin to adopt a small provisional pagan materialism. This is the actual conceptual inflection. Your intimacy with lichen is mediated by a midwife social position. That is extremely historically correct and extremely narratively smooth. The island people notice. They start asking you questions like, what do the tiny ones say this week? They mean it metaphorically. You answer metaphorically. But you both pretend it is literal. The pastor laughs because he thinks this is just a social bonding game. But you know differently. This is actually your epistemic shield. You begin writing constant letters for Copenhagen, long description paragraphs, microtaxonomy pivot tables, weed smell descriptors, dew threshold behavior. You are not sending specimens yet. That comes later. But this early writing is you building infrastructure. You have to build the conceptual runway before you start shipping little crust organisms across an empire. Historians still argue whether these early letters of yours are what primed later Danish lichen labs to take your Iceland series seriously, or whether you got lucky because Copenhagen was bored with macroflora. This argument will never settle. Academics will still be writing papers about the origin of your influence in 2027. There will be fights about this. There will be side blog wars. There will be extremely petty argument threads. You and the pastor's daughter go out at incredibly inappropriate hours. You love the 3 a.m. frost dew surveys. She loves the weird star geometry winter births that sometimes happen at those hours anyway. There's a weird rhythm between your two fields. She will literally just be like, okay, wait here, hold my seal oil lamp. Someone might go into labor in the next hour. And you do. And you just kneel down and keep inspecting lichen growth edge thickness while she delivers a human child in another room. This is the weird composite cosmology of your life now. You also learn to cook seal fat with the exact temperature discipline that becomes identical to your lichen ethanol soaking routine later. Every skill here is double use. Nothing is wasted in Iceland. Not salt. Not peat. Not cognition. Everything is a convertible technique. Second joke this section. You will later tell future Danish naturalists that the single greatest lab discipline training you ever received was maintaining seal fat lamp wicks. They think you are joking. You are absolutely not joking. The pastor begins recognizing that you are not just some curious foreign girl dabbling. He sees your notebook density. He sees how you take 6 pages of field description before you draw 1 line of conclusion. This is when he allows you access to the small parish library. And it is small. But it is extremely specialized. There are old herbals. There are medieval pharmacopoeias. There are monk marginalia about mosses in Latin with notes about how they hold dew longer than grass. There is one old 17th century Danish book that casually mentions lichen as cold symbiotic crusts that do not obey plant logic. You take that phrase and you tape it inside your mind. Cold symbiotic crusts that do not obey plant logic. That is basically your whole brand now. There is one Icelandic midwife superstition that if you place certain types of orange lichen under the mother's pillow during birth, the child will have extra winter resistance. Historians still argue whether this is just metaphor or whether there was some community-level micro-experimental pattern detection. No one knows. You record it anyway. You continue kneeling near basalt until your knees form permanent grooves in your wall. You accidentally invent ergonomics for field kneeling decades before ergonomics becomes a word. You start sketching the pastor's daughter doing midwife procedures and you sketch certain lichens simultaneously. And your brain starts linking scales. Not metaphorically. Mechanically. Reproductive plus survival strategy equivalents across substrates. You sit with the pastor later that winter and he says something extremely Icelandic and extremely profound in that quiet, dry, deadpan way. You study what persists longer than the people who study it. You nearly cry because this is exactly how your lived logic has been forming, but you had never given it that sentence. Third small joke here. You sarcastically tell him that if science ever invents impact factor metrics, lichen will win. He says, what factor? You say, never mind, bad future math plotline, ignore me. He nods like that is normal. Your hands begin to smell permanently like cold phenolic lichen acids. This is now your scent signature. If someone hugged you in Reykjavik, they would smell the basalt coast on you instantly. You lie awake some nights and think, no man in London who classifies organisms from museum drawers will ever be able to replicate this embodied intimacy. This will be your defense. This will be your archive. This will be the reason your work continues to vibrate through the centuries even when they try to erase your name off the title page. And you keep kneeling the next day. And the day after. And the day after that. You are midwife plus scientist hybrid now. And that social camouflage is the reason your lichen empire will quietly start. You winter in seal smoke, which sounds cinematic until your sinuses decide to unionize against you. Turf houses filter smoke like an inefficient neural net. The low ceiling gathers particulate from seal fat lamps, sheep tallow, peat, driftwood, and whatever opportunistic fuel is available that week. You breathe all of it. You begin to consider that Icelandic household winter smoke is actually the original mixed solvent extraction. You are doing science inhalationally whether you choose to or not. You learn the slow skill of surviving silence in wind. The island teaches you that noise is laid into the atmospheric profile like a time series. You begin to differentiate types of wind by spectral shape. There is a hollow telegraphing wind that precedes sleet. There is a metallic ringing wind that precedes ice storm events. There is a wet sighing wind that announces melt cycle. There is a type of weird variable wind that seems to correspond with geothermal vent pulse patterns, and when that one happens the pastor just calmly says, "Don't travel." You listen. Iceland is the kind of teacher where if you ignore a vibe for 48 hours, you die. Mainstream historical fact, anchor winter food scarcity cycles in 19th century Iceland were brutal. Many households measured survival thresholds not by calendar date but by how far into winter the preserved fish and hard cheese stocks lasted. Time was not linear, it was thickness of remaining resources. So you start thinking like that too. Your mind becomes resource weather aware. Hunger becomes a measurement unit. Days are indexed by whether you are pre-hunger, mid-hunger, or improvisational hunger. Your lichen work must adapt. Winter means you cannot traverse certain basalt corridors safely. You must choose indoor microstudy. You begin taking micro-scrapings of crustose species and placing them in little improvised humidity chambers, glass jar, wall lining, pebbles, variable water droplet size. You begin to test rehydration latency. You start noticing that some species respond to humidity shifts within minutes. Others take days. And some seemingly never change at all but do subtle chemical pH drift instead. You are literally observing organisms that have different philosophies of time. This becomes the central epistemic pivot that permanently alters your worldview. Lichen is not slow plant. Lichen is tempo pluralism. You keep writing letters to Copenhagen describing this. You do not yet have a theoretical scaffold for symbiosis plus tempo distribution lattice, but you are already building that architecture implicitly. The pastor's daughter sometimes sits beside you, doing small mending tasks, while you stare at a small crust in a jar for what looks like an unreasonable amount of time. She shrugs and tells house visitors she is reading them, which is unexpectedly accurate. There is a small Icelandic folk claim that seal smoke increases certain types of dream narrative vividness. The pastor says he thinks that is superstition. Midwives say absolutely not. You are genuinely undecided. Historians still argue whether this has any basis in ritual psychophysiology or was simply a result of chronic low-grade smoke intoxication. You find yourself using this ambiguous territory as micro-metaphors in your lichen notes. You sketch more. You change your sketch stroke because winter indoor observation is different from outdoor basalt survey. Outdoor strokes were crisp, angular, mapping edges. Indoor strokes become soft, shading-based, time-based. You begin to feel like you are animating slow microtheater. You label each jar with sub-Latin names that combine fungal genus roots with Icelandic winter metaphor. You are constructing conceptual scaffolds that Copenhagen will not understand until far too late. Second light joke here. You eventually realize you are spending more time trying to understand why these organisms wake up at different humidity deltas than you ever spent trying to understand your last romantic crush. Which, honestly, is growth. Your body begins to change. You get winter joints. Your knuckles develop a tiny microache that becomes predictive of storm fronts. Your knees have basalt memory. Your hair permanently smells like peat. But you also become metabolically calmer. Your resting mind rate slows. You are adapting to geological intervals. Historians still argue whether this psychological slow time attunement is what gave you the conceptual stamina to continue this work, even though institutions would later try to minimize and trivialize it. There is no stable consensus here. Nobody knows if the conceptual rigor was endogenous to you, or whether the island carved it into you like nature carving runes into driftwood. Inside the turf house, long midwinter nights are the story economy. Every person here becomes an oral historian by necessity. You take mental notes on how Icelandic narrative structure handles time. Icelandic story logic uses slow build layering rather than climax vector. That structure infects your scientific writing. That technique, narrative time scaffolding, is why your field notes will remain legible 140 plus years later when glacier retreat scientists rediscover your archive. Third joke this section. You tell the pastor that future people will develop a micro-dopamine addiction to fast-scrolling ephemeral content. He says, "What is scrolling?" You stare into the seal lamp flame for 10 awkward seconds and then say never mind. You start mapping micro distribution of certain species inside the turf house itself. You realize indoor lichen distribution patterns are tiny environmental spy instruments. Where smoke condenses more heavily, one species cluster. Where condensation drip is stronger, another. Where the turf roof leaks slightly during thaw, rare mint disk. The house becomes a living lab. This is how you learn that your science must include domestic microtopography. Copenhagen never will. London definitely won't. This will be another reason your archive will matter later. You studied the microecology of lived life. Not just the museum-safe lab version. You are also quietly learning Icelandic emotional stoicism. Not performative. Functional. You learn that silence is not void. Silence is bandwidth. Silence is data. Silence is when the island does the teaching. You begin sleeping less at night and more in odd mid-afternoon micronaps. Winter does that to temporal frameworks. You start thinking of time as non-uniform viscous flow. Like lichen acids slowly dissolving basalt grain. Like seal smoke slowly changing the color of your wool garments. Small historical anchor. Charles Lyell publishes Principles of Geology in the 1830s, pushing uniformitarianism, slow change across deep time. You won't read him until later. But Iceland is teaching you this principle embodied long before you see his words. Slow change is not theoretical here. It is perceptual. It is present tense reality. There is a moment one night when the wind stops. Just absolutely zero air movement. The silence is so strong you feel it as a pressure drop. You sit up in your turf bed and realize, this is the baseline. Lichen live here all the time at this baseline. You whisper to yourself, this is the tempo I must defend. This is the winter seal smoke vow moment. This is when your lichen research becomes spiritual discipline rather than hobby classification. Your body is winter adapted now. Your mind is basalt interval. You can survive this epoch. And now, when spring comes, you will already be half lichen yourself. You emerge into spring with a very specific hyperfocus, naming the unloved things. which is the thing that most academics secretly cannot stomach, because naming the beautiful is social currency, but naming the boring is where science actually gets built. The rocks still hold the winter salt signature. Your knees have the map geometry of every crash route you used all last season. And now, you start writing tiny organism biography with tweed ink like it actually matters politically. Because you know, if you give them names that actually stick, men in London will not be able to easily erase them later without looking extremely suspicious. You begin doing the thing every later grad student would call insane. You begin building dense relational cross-naming tables under multiple semantic systems. Latin plus Icelandic metaphor plus your own semi-computational category tags that describe tempo plus substrate plus risk profile plus color drift plus bird and salt adjacency. You invent the three-axis lichen naming triad: color, tempo, substrate. You feel smug that no man in London 3,000 kilometers away will ever be able to reproduce this from museum drawers because they will not have the lived substrate. You are literally embedding anti-erasure into your naming architecture by linking name to place. Mainstream historical fact for this section: the 19th century concept of standardized biological nomenclature was still wildly contested. Even well into mid-century, botanists were arguing over whether descriptive phrase names were more pure science than fixed binomial labels. You weaponize that chaos. You deliberately use the fluidity. You are building a network identity structure that will survive multiple archive migrations. The pastor's daughter watches you build classification tables and she laughs and says, "No baby is named this complicated." And you answer, "These are not babies. These are time anchors." She then says, "If you ever have a child someday, God help them trying to choose a baby name file system with you." First small joke here in your voice. You start inventing imaginary lichen conference review number 2 in your head who hates every micro-naming choice you make, and you mutter at him while writing like he is real and can hear you. The pastor's daughter overhears one time and now she occasionally asks you, "Is reviewer 2 satisfied today?" You tell her no. Reviewer 2 is eternally angry. You move across basalt corridors that are now soft thaw. The orange crust on sea-facing faces is brighter. The mint crust is water fat. The sulfur yellow thin films are chemically loud. You get obsessed with the transitional categories, what you call proto-crust language. Lichen morphotypes that feel like they are between categories, in flux, in emergence. You realize that these intermediate forms are the place where classification authority tends to break. That is where London men will attempt to flatten nuance into simplistic boxes. That is where you will resist archive flattening. There is a tiny island rumor that some very old isolated black crust type you find occasionally near geothermal seep edges can actually etch faint patterns into thin basalt flakes over decades that resemble sigils. Historians still argue whether those patterns are real chemical abrasion signatures or pareidolia created by desperate humans looking for meaning in slow geometry. You think it is a little bit of both. You think the substrate is writing back very slowly. Naming becomes your ritual. Naming becomes a metaphysical defense. You begin writing into your notebook that taxonomic identity is a geopolitical act. This is far ahead of your time. But you already see it. Second small joke here. You catch yourself thinking, if taxonomists ever get paid by the classification, I am retiring early. Then you realize taxonomists will never get paid properly. You laugh again. You begin mailing your early small naming schema fragments to Copenhagen with your field letters. You are testing them. You are sending early fragile grammar packets to see what breaks in translation. And naturally, some Danish clerks simply refuse to reproduce your Icelandic metaphors. They strike them out and rewrite them in plain Latin or plain Danish botanical description. This makes you furious, but you do not show fury. You simply modify structure so metaphors become necessary for decoding. You hide meaning inside cross-reference. You force them to include the Icelandic layer by making it mathematically required to decode classification logic. Historians still argue whether this encrypted naming architecture was intentional sabotage of future England-based appropriation, or whether you were simply aesthetically attached to Icelandic metaphor. You know the truth. Both. You built anti-theft constraint into structure. Third joke here. You write in your notebook margin, naming is my anti-colonial diem. No one will understand that for 150 years, but that is fine. The future will get the meme. You spend full days walking and muttering names out loud like incantations. The pastor's daughter sometimes hears you whisper new ones like spells. She begins teasingly calling you the lichen witch, which honestly feels like the correct prestige class. You have now unlocked it fully. Your confidence becomes extremely quiet and extremely lethal. Because now you understand, if you can name the unloved things, you become the historian of slow time. Your lichen biography writing is the real start of your empire. The Royal Danish Archive letters start becoming your second respiratory system. Every month you sit at the small turf table with lamp wick trimmed to the thickness of a surgeon's moral line, and you write long lichen reports to Copenhagen that arrive like ghost documents. Because the information flow speed is geologically hilarious. Fast subjective time. You, kneeling on basalt, scribbling data like tiny volcanic priests. Slow objective time. Those letters sometimes take 7, sometimes 9, sometimes 11 weeks to make it across the ocean like half-forgotten, half-starved migrating language birds. By the time Copenhagen receives them, half your observational present has already evolved into different humidity architectures. Your first quiet joke this section. Every time you seal one envelope you whisper to yourself, "May the postal gods have mercy." If you had a Patreon, this would be your $3 tier. You learn the Danish colonial bureaucracy wants linear deliverables. They want extractable data, crisp classification, stable binomial anchors. And here you are, sending them relational tempo matrices that only make sense in Icelandic humidity dialect. You are sending them field notes that behave like riddle keys. You are sending them relational context that cannot be flattened without killing the meaning. Mainstream historical fact anchor. Denmark absolutely did maintain real, formal archival natural history reporting infrastructure from colonial periphery to metropole, and Iceland was formally under Danish monarchy all the way into 20th century. But those bureaucratic pipelines were never designed for things that require embodied microsubstrate experience to interpret. They were designed for recognizable botanical stuff. They were designed for museum taxidermy logic. They wanted dried herbarium sheets. They wanted things that behaved like plants. Your lichens refuse to behave like plants. Symbiosis is an epistemic escalation and they don't know how to receive that. Some clerk in Copenhagen, some bored mid-level classification man, starts writing passive-aggressive little notes in the margins of your returned packets like unclear, ambiguous, please define category boundaries more strictly, Latin only please, Danish translation acceptable, Icelandic metaphor not actionable. You nearly tear one return letter in half. The pastor tells you to not react because reacting would give them what they want, flattening compliance. Historians still argue whether this marginal clerk was one specific identifiable man, or whether this passive-aggressive marginalia voice is actually multiple Danish bureaucrats blended into one identity. Your emotional memory version is definitely one specific man because your rage simplifies him into archetype. Every scientist has that antagonist. Every scientist has that mid-level classification guy who wants to shrink your cosmos into dull boxes so he can feel big. You start structuring your monthly letters like stealth curriculum. You structure each packet like slow incremental onboarding. You take them by the hand and move them through the conceptual scaffolding of symbiosis and tempo architecture, one tiny deliberate month at a time. So by the time you get into heavy substrate-specific naming models, they are already half poison inoculated. They already partly understand the game, even if they don't admit it. There was a belief among a few coastal households that certain black lichen on basalt near the whale haul areas could hold anger from past storms, like a mineral emotional battery. Historians still argue whether that belief emerged from old folk pagan survivals, or from later 17th to 18th century Danish pietist filter distortions, or whether it was a purely aesthetic pattern recognition humans impose on long-lived surfaces. You write this in your notebook because emotionally it feels extremely true. These organisms hold storm memory. You can smell emotional residue in their chemical coats. Second light joke here. You start announcing to the pastor's daughter that lichen are my version of gossip. She answers without missing a beat, yes, but your gossip takes 40 years to resolve. And yes. Good. Exactly. Glacial gossip. That is the tempo you operate in now. Some months your letters go out in small oak boxes with sealed paper envelopes inside so they don't get salt saturated. Other months you send only extremely thin letter parchment wrapped in fish skin envelope because that's what you had. One month you send only Icelandic metaphoric classification because you are furious at the London men, already in anticipation, before their appropriation even happens. You start pre-resisting appropriation before appropriation even hits timeline. Your temporal defense is proactive. Mainstream scientific line. Carl Linnaeus never fully dealt with lichen classification in his original system with the same rigor he applied to vascular plants. Which means, you have more freedom than you should. And you know that. The pastor tells you this might be your one actual structural advantage. Your slow field science is happening precisely in the taxonomic shadow zone before men in London calcify the field with false authority. So you exploit it. You begin shipping very tiny specimen fragments occasionally, but always in information-nested context, never naked uncontexted scrap. You send humidity matrices along with substrate diagram sketches along with color delta notes across time windows. You are inventing multidimensional metadata before metadata is a word. You start writing your letters not like personal field diaries but like extremely slow asynchronous scientific mentorship modules. You treat Copenhagen like a student, which is the most chaotic reversal imaginable in 1830s gendered empire hierarchy. You quietly giggle inside about this all the time. Third joke this section. One night you tell the pastor's daughter, I think this month I am going to neg the Danish archive a little, just slightly. She doesn't know that word but she understands the vibe instantly and she says yes. Do it. They deserve to work harder if they want your information stream. She is correct. But through all of this, there is a real serious economic and existential risk. If the Danish archive completely loses interest, if they decide you are too eccentric, they could sever the pipeline. If they sever the pipeline, you become an unabsorbed anomaly. If you become an unabsorbed anomaly, your work risks vanishing into local Icelandic oral memory only. Which is beautiful culturally but catastrophic for future climate science. Historians still argue whether the structural Danish archive pipeline is actually what saved your data long-term or whether your later herbarium was the real safeguard. There is no consensus. Both are necessary. Archive redundancy is survival. So every month you walk to the small coastal outpost where packet mail gets loaded onto whatever ship is making the ocean attempt next. And every month your stomach feels like you are launching a tiny living symbiotic satellite into a hostile empire network. And every month you walk home in basalt wind with the same vow. You will not let London men later take this field from you. Because you built this field molecule by molecule. Slow humidity delta by slow humidity delta. Naming the unloved things. into existence. So slowly that the archive itself must adapt to you. You trudge toward the basalt cliffs, your boots crunching on frost-crusted lava, feeling the Atlantic wind slice at your cheeks like impatient editors. Today is not like the usual survey stroll. Today is collecting on ice roofs. Not your cozy turf roof, not a driftwood perch, but the frozen, overhanging, vertical basalt drip faces where lichen grows like stubborn graffiti. You stare upward at the icy alcoves. Tiny crystal daggers hang from every lip, translucent and evil, and your inner voice whispers, "This is literally where people quietly die." And that is exactly why you are here. The first historical fact: 19th century Icelandic field naturalists often risked fatal falls because much of the island's flora, including rare lichens, clung exclusively to vertical basalt cliffs. There were no harnesses, no helmets, no rescue chains. Your forebears in the pasture network have survived only because instinct and prudence outweigh ego in those environments. You are about to test that principle yourself. You approach the alcove base, eyes tracing every dribble of frozen meltwater that could betray a weak hold. The overhangs are half sheer, half cauliflowered basalt formations, with ice that creaks under your weight like a warning drum. Your fingers are wrapped in layers of wool and oilcloth, and still they feel like brittle twigs. You have learned by now that temperature is not just cold, it is a tactile accelerant for error. You test a small foothold. It holds. You inch upward, each hand gripping micro-ledges, each foot balancing on the delicate lattice of ice-thin drips. One false placement, and gravity has its own agenda. Some Icelandic folklore holds that certain overhanging basalt formations are guardian stones that prevent the worst winter storms if you climb respectfully. Historians still argue whether this is purely metaphorical or early observation-based geomantic superstition. You whisper a polite greeting to the largest drip, because there is no harm in psychological armor. You reach the first collectible patch of crustose lichen, the pale mint discs glinting like tiny moons. You kneel on a narrow ledge no wider than a knitting needle's length, bracing with one hand while your other carefully scrapes a minimal fragment for your specimen jar. Your knees are frozen in tangle. Your core is engaged. Your fingers shake, but the organism is collected intact. You breathe slowly. Survival is not incidental here, it is procedural. Second small joke. You silently mutter, "Thank you for not being a dinosaur today." The wind shrieks in agreement, a perfect second punchline. The cliff face is a microecosystem. Every horizontal drip line has slightly different mineral saturation. Each tiny fissure hosts a distinct lichen chemotype. You notice one with a faint sulfur tint, growing where meltwater pools just a millimeter deeper. Your field notes explode with descriptors: mint sulfur micro-mosaic, substrate fissure number 17, drip arc delta -3 mm, humidity retention, plus 0.12 relative. You are the only human in the world making sense of this scale today. Your footing is never fully secure. Every step is a negotiation with the cliff. You test microanchors with your fingertips, feeling for porous basalt versus solid volcanic laminate. Your body is fully awake, every nerve and muscle engaged in a simultaneous coordination symphony. This is your extreme apprenticeship, beyond mere observation. You are integrating hazard, environment, organism, and data in one embodied cognition. Mainstream historical anchor. Female naturalists and field collectors in peripheral colonies often faced official skepticism for physically dangerous work. In Iceland, cultural permission was occasionally mediated by pastoral approval, but there were no formal safety protocols. Surviving these cliffs was as much about social legitimacy as physical skill. You pause, dangling your small leather-bound notebook in a gloved hand. You document: ledge number 4, crack moss margin, micro ice thickness 2.3 millimeters, collection safe. Every entry is simultaneously a survival log and a scientific note. You begin to perceive how risk shapes knowledge. Lichen only reveals its full morphology to the patient, the cautious, the attentive, and the physically competent. Third joke. You imagine a London gentleman botanist peering at your notes, complaining, "She is describing ice, rocks, and moss, but where are the diagrams of the chase?" You laugh to yourself, because he would never understand that the baseline of observation here is survival first, classification second. Wind gusts snatch your hood, whip your hair across your eyes, but you keep scraping. Each tiny fragment is a thread in a centuries-long network of Icelandic natural history. Every scrape is a microclaim of knowledge, a way to mark your presence in a place that might otherwise erase you. Your pulse beats not just for life, but for the persistence of detail. One thin ice strip above you has captured a tiny leaf trapped inside a lichen colony. Historians still argue whether such incidental inclusions influenced early observational bias in microtaxonomy. You record it anyway, every anomaly counts. Your descent is measured. You do not slip. You do not fall. Every motion is deliberate. You feel the strange elation of extreme embodied epistemology, the kind of satisfaction impossible to achieve in desks or libraries. Your knees scream, your arms tremble, but you survive. Your notebook and your specimens are intact. Your ego is intact. And, most importantly, your sense of humor is intact. By the end of the day, your boots are wet, your wool smells of smoke and basalt, and your hair carries faint lichen acids. You have collected what most naturalists would consider impossible specimens. You have expanded the boundaries of both fieldwork and female scientist legitimacy. And you do it without permanent injury. You are tired, yes, but triumphant in the quiet, self-contained victory of survival plus knowledge. Historians still argue whether such extreme collection methods were more about necessity or about cultivated discipline. You know, it is both. The cliff teaches humility, the wind enforces patience, and the organisms themselves reward attention. Nothing else in your 19th century Icelandic life will ever feel so immediate and consequential. You kneel one last time, brush snow from your notebook, and whisper a small victory, "We persist." And indeed, you and the lichens do. You descend slowly, savoring each foothold. By the time you reach solid ground, the sheer vertical ice roof feels almost like a memory imprint on your body. Your muscles remember the balance, your heart remembers the pulse, and your mind begins to imagine the next set of collection challenges waiting beyond the cliffs. You have survived. You have learned. You have claimed a small edge of the natural world. And tomorrow, the ice roofs will await again. Spring begins to insist itself into your bones and your notebooks. The air is lighter, the sea less a constant threat, and the basalt cliffs you survived last month gleam wet and honest in the morning light. You trudge through thawing lava fields, your boots sinking slightly into frost-softened scree. Every step carries the memory of the ice roofs, the alcove overhangs, the hanging daggers, the creaking of microcrystalline tension under your fingers. You have survived, yes, but survival has left you recalibrated. You are slower, more deliberate. Your eyes trace edges differently, noticing subtle color shifts that would have been invisible before, and you realize, the world is a lattice of microtempo variations, and you are becoming fluent in its language. The first mainstream historical fact: Iceland in the early 19th century experienced spring thaws that could drastically alter the accessibility of cliffs and lichen-rich surfaces. Naturalists frequently had to adjust collection schedules in real time, a practice that required both intimate ecological knowledge and extreme patience. You feel that patience settling into your muscles, a new kind of muscle memory that guides every step, every handhold, every note in your leather-bound journals. You start mapping new areas, edges of basalt that were previously inaccessible under winter ice. Tiny fissures reveal lichens previously hidden, delicate fruticose strands curling over water-worn cracks, moss-like green tufts resisting gravity, orange and yellow crusts that seem to pulse faintly in response to sunlight and humidity. You kneel repeatedly, carefully detaching microfragments and cataloging them with meticulous cross-referencing. Your notebooks have become more than logs. They are microtopographic maps, chemical diaries, and tempo diagrams all at once. Each page is a claim of both knowledge and presence. The Icelandic islanders tell stories of sleeping lichens, organisms that supposedly awaken only when certain frost-thaw cycles occur. Historians still argue whether these were literal observations of seasonal rehydration behavior or poetic metaphors for the slow rhythms of nature. You record the stories anyway, because the folklore resonates with the slow temporal framework you now inhabit. Your daily rhythm is uncanny. Mornings are for basalt surveys, midday for indoor microstudy, afternoons for sketching and note consolidation, evenings for cross-referencing your Icelandic descriptors with Latin nomenclature. Every action is guided by what you think of as the lichen's tempo. Some species respond to moisture in hours, others over days, and a few seem inert to human measurement entirely, yet their edges reveal subtle changes if you watch long enough. Your apprenticeship is deepening. You are learning to think in incremental temporal units, aligning your body and mind with the microtempos of the natural world. Second small joke. You tell the pastor's daughter that lichens are the original slow influences. She laughs and counters, saying, "And you are their obsessed follower." Accurate. You admit it. She grins knowingly. Observation has never been this social. You notice subtle patterns along basalt walls that were overlooked before. Lichen colonies are not random. They respond to microtopography, to wind channels, to dripping water, to buried perches, to past salt spray. You start hypothesizing small relationships, building a mental model of substrate preference, moisture thresholds, and competitive exclusion among crust types. Your notes reflect this complex network: arrows, tables, microdiagrams, and short Icelandic descriptors that indicate qualitative nuance. The archive in Copenhagen will not fully grasp this level of integration, yet you send every packet, hoping that some insight survives translation. Historians still argue whether the observational intensity of peripheral naturalists like you influenced later taxonomic frameworks, or whether these insights were merely anecdotal until formalized by metropolitan institutions. You do not care. You are building knowledge that is embedded in the landscape itself. It will outlive the bureaucrats. You also begin noticing the subtle smell profiles of lichens post-thaw: faint sulfur, muted seaweed, a sweet mineral undertone, and a hint of peat smoke drifting from the tough houses below. Each odor cues specific observations: hydration response, substrate chemistry, growth stage. You take careful notes. Your sense of smell is now a primary data instrument. Third small joke. You whisper to one fruticose colony, "Don't get too smug just because you smell nice." You laugh, alone, but the lichens do not care. You like that about them. The pastor's daughter continues her human midwifery, and you observe her with awe, recognizing the parallel between human gestational timelines and the slow developmental rhythms of lichens. You draw small conceptual diagrams comparing gestational stages to lichen life cycles, noting emergent properties, substrate specialization, and environmental triggers. You realize the training you have absorbed here blends natural observation with social apprenticeship in ways that textbooks cannot capture. Local law claims that certain greenish lichen will only grow in areas where a human has taken careful, respectful steps, as if it responds to ethical attention. Historians still argue whether these observations are coincidence or a form of embedded folk experimental design. You accept the ambiguity. The data is small but persistent. You begin preparing for a larger expedition along cliffs farther north, where microclimatic conditions vary even more dramatically. You make a mental map of potential hazards, ice formations, basalt drips, wind gust channels, and the unpredictability of thaw. You are not naive, you respect the danger. But unlike last winter, your body and mind now operate in a calibrated rhythm. You understand the terrain, your instruments, your organisms, and your limits. By mid-spring, your body has adapted to the physical stress of repeated basalt climbs and cliff edge kneeling. Your hands are permanently textured by basalt and lichen acids. Your knees remember the contours of ledges, the subtle give of ice and stone, and your eyes track micropatterns like a radar system. You begin to appreciate that knowledge in this landscape is inseparable from embodied experience. Your mind is learning to read surfaces as an integrated map of time, hazard, and biology. Second mainstream fact for context. 19th century Icelandic collectors often observed that microclimate variation on cliffs could create highly localized species distribution, meaning that what seemed like identical basalt in two nearby locations could host completely different lichen communities. Your detailed mapping reflects this reality and allows you to claim unprecedented granularity in your observations. At the end of the day, you sit on a low basalt outcrop, exhausted but exhilarated. The Atlantic stretches gray and restless below. The wind is still sharp but no longer threatening. You trace the paths of your morning survey with your fingers in the rock, as if feeling the invisible lines of microecology. You realize that the slow apprenticeship you began last winter has transformed into a fully integrated methodology. Survival, observation, and analysis are now inseparable. Third small joke. You mumble, "I hope Copenhagen enjoys my footnotes. They might be the most dangerous part of the experiment." The pastor's daughter chuckles without explanation. She does not need to. She understands. The cliffs, the lichens, the wind, the ice, all of it is now a conversation. You are fluent in its dialect. The work is still dangerous, but you move with a new confidence. Each careful step, each precise scrape, each note sent to Copenhagen is part of a growing legacy. You have survived the ice roofs and learned from them. And you know that the next phase, broader collection, expanded taxonomy, more nuanced correspondence, is ready to begin. The cliffs to the north are a different world altogether. Not just colder, not just taller, but the basalt is patterned with vertical veins of frost that hold a language all their own. You approach them in early morning fog, boots crunching on frost and shattered lava pebbles, feeling the familiar pulse of anticipation and hazard. Every slope, every overhang, every drip line demands respect. You are no longer a novice. Your muscles remember the ice, your eyes anticipate the subtle shimmer that indicates a precarious hold, your fingers have learned the delicate balance between scraping specimens and preserving substrate integrity. But the risk is real. One slip could send you tumbling, even if you trust your experience. Mainstream historical anchor. During the 19th century, peripheral collectors often ventured into increasingly inaccessible sites precisely because competition for unique specimens was fierce, and rare lichens clinging to alcoves were prized. The Icelandic coastlines rewarded those who could physically endure the environment while maintaining observational precision. You are one of those rare, careful collectors. Local fishermen whisper that the northern basalt veins can sing when the wind passes through icicle formations. Historians still argue whether this is early acoustic observation of frost resonance or pure imagination. You pause to listen. The wind hums a low, eerie note. You write it in your notebook anyway, possible microacoustic indicator of frost stability. The data may be useless, but the act grounds you in place, a ritual of careful attention. You begin the climb along an alcove ridge where the ice strips hang thicker, forming translucent curtains. You brace yourself, testing each foothold. One hand scrapes a patch of mint green crustose lichen while your other fingers press against the basalt for stability. The ice beneath shudders slightly, your pulse spikes. Every movement is calculated. You have survived winter cliffs before, but northern basalt brings micro surprises, hidden frost pockets, subtle overhang shifts, and drip lines that respond to sunlight in unexpected ways. You whisper reminders to yourself: slow, deliberate, observe, preserve. Second small joke. You mutter to a lichen colony: if I survive this, you owe me coffee in Copenhagen. The wind swirls, taking your words into the void. No reply, as expected. As you progress, you notice ecological microgradients previously invisible. Tiny orange crusts cling where moisture retention is highest. Sulfur yellow films occupy drip-deficient zones. Faint gray patches colonize frost-prone ledges. You document each zone meticulously. Your notebook becomes a topographic temporal atlas. Each entry notes substrate, ice thickness, light exposure, nearby bird perches, wind direction, and hydration response. You have turned observation into a multi-layered mapping project. Historians still argue whether peripheral fieldwork like yours constituted protoecology or merely extreme specimen collection. You don't care. Your goal is knowledge rooted in lived reality, not just in preserved herbarium sheets. You pause at a precarious ledge and glance down. The sea is a gray blur, and the wind has a sharpness that cuts through wool. Your fingers tremble from both cold and anticipation. You collect a tiny fragment of black crust lichen, placing it into a miniature container you have designed for minimal disturbance. You note color, moisture retention, microfissure location, and subtle frost microabrasion patterns. Every detail is crucial. Each fragment carries ecological and temporal information no herbarium can replicate. Third small joke. While cataloging the black crust, you whisper, "Don't tell the London men about me yet, I'm still practicing my magic." The humor steadies your nerves. Descending the ridge is a slow negotiation. Your body remembers the ice, the basalt, the minute microslopes. Every movement is a conversation with the landscape. You are both observer and participant. The lichens respond indirectly, through subtle shifts in hydration and color. You have learned to read these signals as communication. Some northern fishermen claim that certain lichens predict minor tremors by subtly detaching from the rock and resettling. Historians still debate whether this is coincidental or early seismic observation. You record the phenomenon cautiously, noting drip lines and freeze-thaw cycles as possible explanatory variables. At the base of the cliffs, your hands smell faintly of peat, frost, and lichen acids. Your knees and fingers are stiff, but uninjured. You survived. Your notebook is filled with hours of careful observation, your specimen containers intact, your body a living map of lessons learned. Each step has reinforced the slow tempo method that defines your scientific approach. Survival and science are inseparable. By the time you return to the turf houses, exhausted but exhilarated, the northern cliffs have imprinted themselves into your memory. You understand that these extreme collection sites are not merely dangerous, they are knowledge amplifiers. The physical challenge, the risk, the delicate observation, it all creates a heightened sensitivity to microtempo variation in both substrate and organism. You realize that the success of your methodology depends not only on intellectual rigor but on embodied risk. You write in your notebook before sleep. The northern basalt teaches patience, humility, and fluency in slow knowledge. Each ice drip a punctuation mark, each lichen a syllable in the language of time. You feel an immense satisfaction in surviving without injury and bringing back both specimens and insight. Mainstream historical fact wrap. Female naturalists frequently had to balance extreme physical fieldwork with social expectations and correspondence duties, often inventing methodologies that were as much about personal survival as about taxonomy. Your apprenticeship has now reached a point where these two domains are inseparable. And as you drift off to sleep under peat smoke haze, the northern cliffs echo in memory. You are learning to survive, to observe, to catalogue, and to translate nature's slow messages into a form that can reach the distant archives without losing essence. You have learned once again, patience and caution are as critical to knowledge as observation itself. Summer begins with an almost violent intensity. The wind has softened, but the daylight stretches endlessly across moss and basalt, giving you time to chase lichen in ways that winter never allowed. You walk through glacial meltwater streams, boots half submerged, notebook balanced precariously in one hand. Every droplet splashes across sketches and notes, but you are used to this. You have long since learned that Iceland's ecology demands improvisation. And, frankly, your inner voice whispers, if you survive this, you are officially married to the terrain. Mainstream historical fact. Iceland's short summers meant that 19th century naturalists had a narrow fieldwork window, usually from late May to early August, to record both reproductive and vegetative stages of plant and lichen life. This scarcity of time meant that careful observation and efficient collection were paramount. You feel the pressure in every stride, every note, every specimen carefully detached from its substrate. Local law claims that certain lichens release microspores that respond to the length of daylight, supposedly dancing under extended sun. Historians still argue whether this was an early observation of photoperiodism or metaphorical storytelling. You record it anyway, observing subtle shifts in spore sacs that confirm at least part of the phenomenon. You are no longer merely collecting, you are composing the landscape into a living map. Every basalt outcrop, every fissure, every microcrust is a note in a symphony of habitat. You take meticulous sketches, noting color gradation, edge thickness, humidity, and even tiny insect interactions. Your field notebook now contains layers: descriptive, temporal, chemical, ecological. The system is both intuitive and precise, a mesh of observation and personal method. Second small joke. You whisper to a colony of fruticose lichen, "Try not to grow too fast, I'm still catching up." They do not answer, of course, but the humor steadies your hands, keeps your pulse manageable as you balance on slippery basalt. You encounter a small colony that seems anomalous, slightly golden, almost translucent against the gray-black basalt. You crouch, examine them, and realize they inhabit a microclimate created by a tiny fissure that channels geothermal warmth. You sketch the fissure pattern, measure temperature and moisture, and carefully remove a few tiny fragments for your collection. Your method is now surgical and patient. Every fragment carries layers of data: microclimate, substrate, color, morphology, and tempo. Historians still argue whether early 19th century microclimate observation constituted protoecology or merely careful note-taking. You do not care. The data matters to the organisms and to the slow time network you are building. You are literally integrating life histories, substrate chemistry, and human attention into one analytic framework. Summer days blur into one another. You move across basalt outcrops, sketching, collecting, and observing. The pastor's daughter continues her human midwifery, and you notice parallels between the subtle rhythms of gestation and the slow growth of your lichens. You sketch mental models comparing reproductive cycles of humans and the tempo of lichen colonization. Emergent patterns begin to appear. Small differences in moisture or sunlight cause delayed reactions in some crusts, while fruticose strands respond within hours. You start annotating each observation with your own Icelandic metaphors, creating a hybrid coding system that Copenhagen will only partially understand. Third joke. You mumble to yourself, "I'm basically running a lichen boot camp for Copenhagen." You smile at your own ridiculousness, knowing the humor is your survival tool as much as it is your creative process. You notice subtle scent changes, the sweet mineral undertones of basalt mixing with faint peat smoke and wet lichen. These olfactory cues guide micro-decisions in sampling. You realize that all your senses are instruments in this field laboratory: sight, touch, smell, balance, and even intuition. This multisensory approach amplifies your data, ensuring that no variable, however minute, goes unnoticed. Some Icelandic stories claim that inhaling the combined scent of basalt, peat, and lichen during summer increases observational clarity. Historians still debate whether this is metaphor or early psychophysiological insight. You inhale deeply anyway, feeling attuned to every micro-detail of your environment. You begin preparing for more distant expeditions along the northern basalt cliffs, creating detailed maps of both hazard and habitat. You balance survival, observation, and systematic collection. Every movement is deliberate, calibrated against past experience with ice roofs and winter alcoves. The work is still dangerous, but your body and mind now operate in a rhythm perfectly synchronized with the terrain. Survival and science are inseparable. By the end of each day, your notebooks are dense with observational networks, your specimen containers are carefully labeled and secured, and your body carries the memory of movement, balance, and microtempo awareness. Summer has revealed that knowledge and survival are intertwined, that the world will only yield its secrets to those who move carefully, think patiently, and observe relentlessly. Mainstream historical anchor. The integration of microclimate data, careful observation, and specimen collection was a hallmark of the most successful 19th century field naturalists. You now embody that integration fully, translating embodied experience into an enduring archive. As dusk falls, you sit on a basalt ledge, looking across the glacial meltwater streams. You feel the hum of life, the subtle pulse of crusts, mosses, and microinvertebrates. You whisper to yourself, "This is the tempo I defend. This is the slow rhythm that matters." And with that, you begin preparing your notes and specimens for the next stage of correspondence, confident that the archive, the lichens, and the wind have conspired to make this summer one of unprecedented insight. By midsummer, the lichen colonies have become collaborators rather than subjects. You move through the basalt corridors like a conductor guiding an orchestra, each scrape, each observation, each note a gesture that aligns with a rhythm older than humans. The wind has softened but still carries the briny Atlantic bite, which keeps your senses sharp. You trudge along fissured outcrops, boots crunching lightly over basalt rubble, and your hands hover over potential microhabitats, testing edges before committing to a collection. The work is exhilarating but exacting. One misstep could ruin a specimen, or worse, destabilize your footing. Historical fact anchor. Icelandic naturalists in the 19th century often charted extreme microhabitats, including cliff faces, ice overhangs, and geothermal fissures, because these areas hosted species absent from more accessible locations. You are following in their tradition, but your methodology is far more meticulous and integrated. A local fisherman once told you that certain northern cliffs hum at twilight when lichens release spores. Historians still argue whether this is poetic observation, misattributed wind resonance, or an early attempt at environmental acoustics. You listen closely anyway, annotating both the sound and your own physical response, heart rate, microtremor in hands, and attention shifts. You notice the subtle interplay of color, moisture, and slope. Mint green crusts cling where morning dew pools. Orange streaks dominate where basalt channels sunlight. Gray disks thrive in near total shade. You begin overlaying this observational data into layered diagrams, combining substrate chemistry, hydration retention, and wind vector estimates. The result is a multidimensional topography of lichen microhabitats, a map of living, breathing surfaces. First small joke. While sketching, you whisper to a yellow crust, "Try to hold the line, comrades." Copenhagen expects reports. The wind responds with a hiss that could be approval or mockery. You cannot tell, but it steadies you nonetheless. You climb a precarious overhang to reach a tiny fisher colony that has eluded your prior visits. Fingers testing microedges, you scrape minimally and place specimens in their humidity-buffered container. Your body remembers every motion from prior ice roof excursions. Muscles, tendons, and nerves coordinate unconsciously. Survival and collection are now inseparable, a dance of risk and reward that keeps your heart rate just below panic. Historians still debate whether female naturalists' fieldwork often involved intentional risk-taking as a methodological necessity or whether it was culturally tolerated necessity imposed by geographic isolation. Your notes make no distinction. You record the facts, the context, and your own embodied experience. The pastor's daughter appears to observe silently, as she often does. You explain the microgradients: light, moisture, substrate texture, wind direction. She nods, perhaps more intuitively than cognitively, noting how your attention has shifted from mere collection to understanding the hidden dynamics of lichen ecosystems. Second small joke. She comments, "If lichens are alive enough to sing at twilight, are you sure you're not becoming one of them?" You laugh. Perhaps she is right. There is a rhythm to your pulse, a tempo to your gestures, that now mirrors the lichen's microtempos. By late afternoon, you survey a series of adjacent alcoves. Each hosts subtly different assemblages. Crustose varieties edge into fruticose patches, forming gradients that defy easy classification. You realize that your classification system, color, substrate, tempo, is tested daily against nature's refusal to be neatly boxed. Each specimen is a dialogue, an entity asserting its unique rhythm, challenging your categorizations, insisting on precision and patience. One isolated black crust shows a faint sigil-like pattern, eerily similar to those rumored in old Icelandic folk accounts. Historians still argue whether these patterns are meaningful or coincidental. You photograph, sketch, and annotate it anyway, noting the microetching as a potential environmental signal. Evening brings reflection. You sit on a basalt ledge, notebook open, watching the Atlantic shimmer. You realize that your field notes, sketches, and specimens are not just documentation. They are a temporal ledger, a record of slow change and embodied attention. You whisper, "This is why we climb, why we risk, why we persist." Mainstream historical fact. Systematic naturalists often relied on observational redundancy, recording multiple sensory modalities, sight, touch, smell, to increase reliability in their specimens. You have internalized this method to perfection. Your body, your senses, your notebooks, and your specimens are all instruments of rigorous documentation. Third joke. You mutter, "If someone in Copenhagen tries to argue this is excessive, they've clearly never balanced on 40-foot basalt ledges while categorizing life." The wind carries your remark away, but the sentiment sustains your concentration. You gather specimens into the evening light, cross-checking against previous micromaps. The northern cliffs have yielded new crusts, subtle color variants, and a fruticose strand that seems to grow slightly differently depending on frost history. You label each sample with your hybrid Latin Icelandic code, embedding temporal, spatial, and environmental metadata. By the end of the day, you feel the deep satisfaction of merging survival, observation, and taxonomy into one continuous process. As night falls, The Atlantic wind drops to a low hum. You sit among the basalt, exhausted but fulfilled. The cliffs, the lichens, the wind, they have spoken, and you have listened. You are fluent now in the tempo of microecology, your body and mind aligned with both the risk and the subtle rhythms of life. By late summer, your fieldwork takes on a rhythm that borders on meditation. The basalt cliffs, once threatening, have become extensions of your own awareness. You move through them with cautious confidence, boots crunching on fragmented lava, fingers testing microedges, eyes scanning for the slightest hint of crustose or fructose anomalies. The Atlantic wind still bites, but it no longer startles. It is a familiar collaborator, shaping your perception, whispering subtle cues. Each day's survey begins before sunrise, light filtering through morning mist like fine powder over your notebooks. The cliffs are alive, not merely with lichens, but with the language of microclimate, texture, moisture, and subtle temperature shifts. You are fluent in all of it. Mainstream historical fact: 19th century Icelandic naturalists recognized that precise observation of microhabitats was critical to understanding species distributions, especially for cryptic organisms like lichens. The terrain demanded both acute observational skill and bodily endurance. Without both, rare microclimates and fragile species would remain undocumented. You embody this combination fully now. You approach a steep overhang where a curious colony of pale orange lichens thrives. Tucked under a subtle basalt arch, fingers carefully probe the surface, ensuring minimal disturbance. You measure microslope, note drip channels, record subtle color gradations, and extract a few fragments for study. The lichen seems almost alive, responding minutely to your touch with a faint sheen, a subtle shift in hydration, a micro-change in edge curling. You are aware, always aware, that your presence influences the data. Observation and impact are inseparable. Local law claims that certain lichens on northern cliffs contain memory of past storms, holding chemical signatures that correspond to historical wind patterns. Historians still argue whether this is early empirical observation or folkloric narrative. You carefully note both possibilities in your notebook, recording chemical hints, position, and environmental context, aware that future analysis may confirm or refute the stories. Second small joke: while sketching the pale orange colony, you whisper, "Behave yourselves, you're on the record now." The wind whistles back. Humor is a stabilizing force, anchoring your focus amid precarious ledges. You move to a series of microfissures along the basalt wall. Here, crustose patches intermingle with tiny moss-like growths, and subtle fructose strands spiral upwards. You start mapping not only color and substrate but also microtempo, growth rhythm, hydration cycles, and frost response. Your notebook becomes a multidimensional field ledger, capturing the complexity of life that static herbarium sheets cannot convey. Each entry includes location, substrate, light exposure, humidity, color shift, temporal observation, and Icelandic metaphor to preserve nuance lost in Latin translation. Historians still argue whether early detailed field observation constituted protoecology or merely careful natural history collection. You do not care. Your methodology exists for comprehension in situ, embedded in place, not merely in paper. Observation is survival, and survival is observation. You pause at a ledge overhanging the Atlantic spray. The wind lifts, carrying microsalt and faint lichen aroma. You sketch carefully, noting the subtle gradient of green, yellow, and orange, the interplay of moisture and sunlight, and the positions of neighboring colonies. You feel your body attuned to these rhythms, the microtempo of algae and fungi, the fissure vibrations, the gentle sway of air currents. Survival and insight merge seamlessly. Third small joke: you whisper, "This is basically the most exclusive university on the planet," and the tuition is frostbite and wet boots. You laugh quietly. The lichens do not respond, which is as expected. Humor, again, is a stabilizing pulse amid extreme concentration. The pastor's daughter watches silently, occasionally asking questions about humidity retention, slope gradients, or color variation. Her insights are surprisingly precise. She has learned to read the landscape in your absence, intuiting patterns you have taught her indirectly. You begin to think of her as a micro-apprentice in observation ethics, another form of slow pedagogy. One gray crust along the northern overhang exhibits faint sigil-like markings. Historians still debate whether such patterns were naturally occurring mineral abrasions or cultural projection. You photograph, sketch, and annotate meticulously, noting potential environmental triggers. The ambiguity is part of your method. Uncertainty is data. As evening approaches, you descend to the base of the cliffs, your body fatigued but unharmed. Every collected fragment, every note, every sketch is a microclaim of both presence and knowledge. You have integrated extreme observation with bodily awareness, creating a method that transforms survival into a source of scientific authority. Mainstream historical fact, extreme fieldwork, particularly in isolated and hazardous locations, demanded embodied understanding that written instruction could not convey. Your apprenticeship, extended and intensified through repeated summer expeditions, exemplifies this principle. You sit on a low basalt outcrop as the Atlantic darkens, reviewing notes and sketches. Each specimen is catalogued with cross-references: habitat, slope, microclimate, color, temporal pattern. You are simultaneously archivist, collector, and observer, entwined with your data in a continuous feedback loop. This is the essence of your method: slow, precise, and entirely inseparable from the lived landscape. You whisper to yourself as the wind dips. Every lichen, every fissure, every drift, recorded, preserved, understood. The cliffs hum faintly in response, or perhaps it is just your imagination. Either way, you feel aligned with the slow, patient pulse of life itself. Autumn arrives subtly, like a gentle reminder that nothing in Iceland stays constant for long. You trudge across frost-touched scree, boots crunching over basalt fragments softened by the first thaw of seasonal rains. The Atlantic wind has sharpened once more, carrying faint salt and peat smoke, reminding you that the cliffs, the lichens, and the elements are still exacting teachers. Your muscles are accustomed now to climbing, crouching, balancing on microedges. Your fingers sense microgradients in texture before your eyes confirm them. The cliffs themselves seem to have grown familiar, their microhabitats etched into your memory like an intricate map, your body as much an instrument of observation as your notebooks. Mainstream historical fact: Icelandic naturalists in the 19th century had to adapt their collection schedules to seasonal changes. Many species of lichen and moss are highly sensitive to moisture and temperature, which vary drastically in autumn. Those who failed to adjust risked losing key observations. You have internalized this rhythm. Each movement, each choice of specimen, is informed by the changing season. Local lore claims that autumn lichens display subtle preparation behaviors, curling edges in anticipation of frost, almost as if predicting the coming winter. Historians still argue whether this is metaphorical or based on early observations of physiological changes in lichens. You carefully annotate the phenomenon, noting microcurvature, hydration, and substrate orientation, treating folklore as potential empirical data. You approach a northern cliff ledge where the lichens are concentrated in the most sheltered crevices. The overhangs are slippery with rain and early frost, and the basalt is darker, more treacherous. You pause to calibrate your footing. One false step could dislodge a fragment or, worse, compromise your stability. Your past winter experiences with ice roofs guide every motion. Test, brace, shift, scrape, record. You have survived before, and the lessons are etched in muscle memory. Second small joke. You whisper to a tiny orange fruticose strand, "Behave, I've had enough heart attacks for one season." The wind carries your words away. Humor keeps your pulse steady and your focus sharp. You begin collecting in micro-niches, using minimal scraping and carefully noting each fragment's position, light exposure, and moisture levels. Your observations are no longer just visual. Your tactile senses, your sense of balance, and even your subtle awareness of wind currents inform the data. Every action is both survival and research. Your field notebook evolves into a multidimensional ledger, recording temporal, environmental, and morphological variables with precision. Historians still argue whether 19th century peripheral collectors like you were primarily motivated by discovery or by a form of embodied curiosity that integrated survival with scientific observation. In your case, the two are inseparable. Observation is inseparable from risk. Survival is inseparable from understanding. You notice that some lichen colonies are behaving differently, responding to microclimatic shifts caused by recent rainfall and cooling temperatures. Fruticose strands curl more tightly, crustose patches darken, subtle changes occur in edge texture. You sketch, measure, and annotate, adding temporal markers to track shifts over days. Your work becomes a living chronicle, capturing the ephemeral and subtle movements that static herbarium sheets cannot convey. Third small joke. You whisper, "If Copenhagen can't appreciate microdramas, they're clearly not paying attention." The cliffs do not reply, but the humor sustains your rhythm. The pastor's daughter appears at the base of the cliffs to watch silently. She has learned to read your gestures, to anticipate your movements, and to appreciate the delicate balance between observation and survival. She asks a few pointed questions about microgradients, light angles, and moisture retention, revealing that your teaching has been absorbed through observation more than instruction. She is a companion in patience, a mirror to your methods. One gray crust lichen exhibits subtle sigil-like patterns along a fissure wall, reminiscent of patterns noted in local oral history. Historians still debate whether these markings are intentional or coincidental. You document carefully, noting microenvironmental variables, documenting light and moisture exposure, aware that ambiguity is data. As twilight descends, you descend the basalt cliffs with careful precision. Each step is deliberate, your body integrated with memory and terrain. You check each specimen container, notebook, and sketch, ensuring the integrity of your multi-layered observations. Survival, observation, and documentation remain inseparable. Mainstream historical fact. Field naturalists often relied on repetitive, high-frequency observation over months to document life cycles. Your autumn work exemplifies this principle, embedding long-term observation into an embodied methodology. By the end of the day, you sit on a low basalt outcrop, exhausted but fulfilled. You review your field notes, cross-referencing with prior observations and noting emerging patterns. Your work is a dialogue with time itself, an integration of risk, patience, and slow, deliberate scientific inquiry. You whisper, "Every lichen, every fissure, every microtempo, recorded, understood, preserved." And for the first time this autumn, you feel a deep satisfaction that your methods, your persistence, and your cautious bravery are bearing fruit in the form of knowledge both fragile and enduring. The first hints of winter drift into your bones, crisping the morning air and frosting the upper basalt outcrops. You trudge through a landscape transformed, lava fields gleam with moisture, frost-laced microfishes shimmer, and wind-carved overhangs glint like polished stone. Your boots scuff along the familiar scree, and your eyes scan every ledge, every alcove, every patch of crustose and fruticose growth. You are no longer the tentative collector who feared ice roofs. You are fluent in microtempo, in the subtle language of moisture, temperature, and light. Your body anticipates hazards before your mind registers them. Survival and observation are now fully integrated, inseparable companions on every precarious traverse. Mainstream historical fact: 19th century Icelandic naturalists noted that late autumn presented unique challenges and opportunities. Microclimates could fluctuate hourly, frost could form overnight, and previously accessible cliffs could become treacherous. Observations made during this transitional period often revealed subtle life cycle shifts in lichens that summer fieldwork could not capture. You are keenly aware of these temporal subtleties as you move from one alcove to another, recording minute variations in color, hydration, and growth patterns. Some local folklore suggests that late autumn lichens close their eyes in preparation for winter, curling subtly or shifting pigments. Historians still argue whether these are literal observations of physiological change or metaphorical descriptions of seasonal dormancy. You record the phenomenon meticulously, noting that some colonies exhibit a faint spiral in response to overnight frost, while others maintain a flat profile. Your northern expeditions have prepared you for this moment. You approach a vertical basalt face with a delicate overhang, hands testing the surface, fingers feeling microedges. Ice crystals form along fissures, and the wind lifts small sprays of frost. You carefully scrape a colony of pale gray fruticose lichen, documenting microslope, substrate composition, and the subtle moisture retention across the ledge. Each action is deliberate, measured, a conversation between body, environment, and organism. Second small joke. You whisper, "If these lichens survive frost better than I survive this climb, they're clearly superior." The cliffs do not respond, but the humus steadies your pulse. You descend cautiously, taking note of minor variations along the basalt veins, orange crusts deepening in color, gray discs curling slightly, and mint-green patches contracting in response to the first frost. Each detail is recorded with precision in your notebook: substrate, temperature, hydration, orientation, and temporal observation. You begin to see patterns emerge, microgradients that persist across alcoves, revealing subtle ecological rules that are invisible in summer observation. Historians still argue whether peripheral collectors' data on microclimatic variation constituted protoecology or remained anecdotal. You, however, see the practical import of every observation. Survival and analysis are entwined. The rhythm of the cliffs dictates the tempo of knowledge. The pastor's daughter observes quietly, occasionally asking questions about slope angles, light penetration, and moisture retention. Her questions are precise, reflecting her understanding of your apprenticeship. She is learning to read the cliffs, to anticipate hazards, and to respect both the lichens and the physical demands of extreme observation. You recognize her emerging expertise as a testament to your patient, embodied pedagogy. Third small joke. You mutter, "I hope Copenhagen can handle the drama of frost-curled lichens. They've never seen microepics like this." The wind carries your words, mixing humor with focus, keeping you steady on a slippery ledge. You begin your final collection along the northern basalt corridors. Ice-tipped overhangs threaten subtle hazards, but your body is fluent in anticipation. Fingers scrape gently, notes are written with care, and every movement balances the competing priorities of survival, preservation, and observation. The cliffs reward your patience. Colonies are revealed in previously unseen detail, microgradients are measured, and patterns of seasonal response emerge clearly. A faint cigar-like pattern appears along a black crust, reminiscent of early Icelandic folklore symbols. Historians still debate whether these patterns were interpreted natural phenomena or cultural projections. You record it with careful annotations, aware that ambiguity is itself informative. As the day wanes, You survey your collected specimens, cross-referencing observations, sketching final notes, and labeling containers. Survival, observation, and documentation have merged into a continuous methodology. You pause, absorbing the cliff's silent testament. The knowledge you have accrued is embodied, integrated, and immediate. Mainstream historical fact. Extreme peripheral fieldwork required repeated observation across seasons to capture temporal variation, a principle your late autumn expedition embodies fully. Each collected fragment and observation represents both a record and a physical negotiation with Iceland's environment. As dusk descends, you descend to the base of the cliffs, body fatigued but uninjured, notebooks filled, specimens secured. The northern basalt has revealed its micro-secrets, and you have survived to translate them into understanding. Survival, patience, and observation have fused into a singular, embodied methodology, one that has transformed both your mind and body. Winter is whispering now, a pale spectre across the Icelandic landscape. Frost glazes basalt veins, wind-carved ridges glimmer with hoarfrost, and streams hiss faintly as they begin to freeze. You trudge across familiar scree fields, boots scuffing against the granular basalt, your breath steaming in the frigid air. The northern cliffs, once a domain of tentative exploration, now feel like extensions of your own body. Every overhang, alcove, and microfissure is a familiar letter in a long, ongoing correspondence between observer and environment. Your muscles remember the climb, your fingers anticipate microslopes, and your eyes detect the slightest shift in color or moisture. Survival is no longer a gamble, it is an integrated rhythm with the landscape. Mainstream historical fact. 19th century Icelandic naturalists noted that winter conditions made fieldwork extremely hazardous, yet this period offered unique insights into dormant or frost-adapted lichen colonies. These observations contributed to understanding the seasonal ecology of cryptic species. You sense this significance as you prepare to make your final, season-spanning survey. Folklore whispers that winter lichens hold whispers of the sea wind's past moods, their edges curling subtly with memory. Historians still argue whether this is metaphor or early observation of physiological responses. You take meticulous notes, measuring edge curvature, substrate hardness, and frost adherence, aware that even myth can guide perception. You climb toward a high overhang, fingers testing microedges coated with frost crystals. Ice glints in the low winter sun, forming delicate daggers along vertical surfaces. You scrape a pale mint-green crustose colony with surgical care, documenting microslope, moisture retention, and subtle color shifts. Every movement is deliberate. Your body has learned the rhythms of risk, balance, and observation. Survival and collection are inseparable, a practice you have perfected over the seasons. Second small joke. You whisper, "Okay, little lichen, let's survive the winter together." The wind whips your words into the void. Humor steadies your pulse, keeping nerves calibrated while you maintain precise focus. You pause along a northern fissure where subtle gradients of orange and gray lichens form natural mosaics. Light, frost, and moisture create ephemeral patterns, which you document with sketches and temporal annotations. Each colony is a microcosm, a complex system responding to environmental variables over hours, days, and weeks. Your notebook has become an instrument of both observation and temporal archiving. Historians still argue whether peripheral naturalists' seasonal micro-observations laid foundations for later ecological understanding. You do not care. Your method is rigorous, empirical, and embodied. Observation and survival are fused into a single practice, inseparable and mutually reinforcing. The pastor's daughter appears, offering insight into subtle frost patterns, edge curling, and moisture retention in shaded fissures. She has internalized your methods, and her questions are precise, reflecting deep observational fluency. Together, you navigate the cliffs carefully, trading insights and refining annotations. Collaboration is another form of embedded apprenticeship. Third small joke. You whisper to one black crust colony, "If Copenhagen doesn't appreciate this, they clearly hate survival and science combined." You chuckle quietly. Humor is your stabilizing pulse in extreme attention. You complete your final survey along the northern cliffs, carefully collecting, documenting, and sketching each colony. Frost edges glimmer, microgradients reveal themselves, subtle growth patterns from summer through autumn are confirmed. Each fragment, each note, each sketch is a culmination of months of embodied observation. You are now fluent in the rhythm of microecology. One gray sigil-patterned crust seems to respond differently in morning frost versus afternoon thaw. Historians still debate whether this is meaningful or coincidence. You document carefully, noting environmental variables, microslope, and hydration dynamics, acknowledging uncertainty as part of empirical rigor. By the end of the day, you descend to the base of the cliffs. Your body is weary but unharmed, your notebooks filled, specimens secured, observations recorded across a season-spanning archive. You have survived every ice roof, basalt overhang, and northern fissure. Your methodology, combining extreme observation, risk-aware fieldwork, and embodied attention, has matured into a cohesive, reproducible practice. Survival, patience, and observation are fully integrated. Mainstream historical fact: the synthesis of seasonal fieldwork, embodied observation, and careful documentation represents the hallmark of the most accomplished 19th century peripheral naturalists. You have become a living embodiment of this legacy. As twilight deepens, you stand at the base of the northern cliffs, gazing at the frozen Atlantic horizon. Your collected specimens, notebooks, and sketches are evidence of both survival and insight. You whisper a quiet acknowledgement: every lichen, every fissure, every season, recorded and preserved. The cliffs, the lichens, and the wind carry your message, and you feel both humbled and triumphant. The wind drops gently, leaving only a soft, rhythmic hush across basalt and ice. You sit among the rocks, leaning against a familiar overhang, letting the day's tension seep slowly out of your muscles. Your boots are stiff with frost, your fingers tingling with cold, but a deep satisfaction hums through your body. Months of careful observation, patient climbing, and meticulous note-taking have brought you here, to this quiet, embodied understanding of the cliffs and their lichen. You realize that survival has been intertwined with learning, that risk and attention have coalesced into knowledge. The Atlantic horizon glimmers faintly, a line of silver in the fading light. You inhale, carrying the scent of peat, wet basalt, and frost-hardened lichens into your lungs. Every sensory detail, the texture of rock, the subtle hue of crustose colonies, the whisper of the wind, has been integrated into your mind. You feel the slow pulse of time, the rhythm of the seasons captured in the delicate structures clinging to the cliffs. The lichens, unassuming and steadfast, are now co-authors of your understanding, each fragment a story of survival, adaptation, and resilience. Your notebooks, sketches, and collected specimens are not just records, they are physical extensions of your presence in this landscape. You sense the continuum: winter ice, summer thaw, autumn frost, spring renewal, all mapped, measured, and observed. You have witnessed life in microtempo, in quiet persistence, in a way that demands both patience and courage. As darkness descends, you exhale, letting your mind soften, letting the cliffs and lichens settle into memory. Tomorrow they will wait, as will your studies, but for now, the world is gentle. You feel the slow rhythm of survival, observation, and understanding merge into a single pulse. The Atlantic wind hums a lullaby. You close your eyes, trusting the landscape you have learned to read. The knowledge you carry, the specimens you have preserved, and the subtle lessons of patience and presence are yours to hold. Everything is in its place, everything persists.